Hello, everyone. My name is Astrid Anarchy, and today we are going to be watching and reacting to SciShow's video about the quote-unquote de-extinction of quote-unquote dire wolves. Let me just move myself into a better position for this. And yeah, we're gonna watch through it. I'm gonna make some comments and we are gonna figure it out. And chat is gonna continue to be stuck in the void because this is what they deserve. Anyways, here we go.
On April 7th, 2025, a biomedical company called 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗪𝗪 made a huge announcement. For the first time in over 10,000 years, our planet was home to living direwolves, and they'd been the ones to bring them back from extinction. If true, this would be the first successful de-extinction ever. That's a big claim, and it immediately got researchers' attention, and the rest of the internet, including Hank, who's made at least 2 videos on the subject. The biggest question everyone has is, how is this even possible when other de-extinctions haven't even been able to get off the ground? So today, we're gonna talk about direwolves, de-extinction, and some of the fundamental problems with bringing any species, direwolf or not, back from the dead.
Yeah. So back from the dead and in general the claims of it being brought back from the dead is just like it's fundamentally incorrect. We've potentially made a step towards it from my understanding, but it is not and will never be, at least with current technology, possible. Continuing on.
Before we get into bringing the direwolves back, let's talk about the first time they were around. Direwolves lived in North America during the Pleistocene and first appeared at least 250,000 years ago. They were massive, up to 2 meters in length and around 68 kilograms, making them roughly 25% bigger than gray wolves, our now familiar North American species. And trust me, we will be talking a lot about gray wolves today. Researchers hypothesized that direwolves were adapted to eat mega prey that was around in the Americas at the time. Animals like horses and ground sloths and stuff like that. They were also really abundant, at least from what we can tell in the fossil record. We find
For some context here is the fossil record does tend to have a lot of biases just based off of like circumstantial stuff, because what it takes for fossils to be preserved for any length of time is very, very specific conditions. So yeah, that there's probably already a bias towards it, and if they naturally inhabited around the levaitre pits for years, it's kind of bound to happen. But yeah, it is weird just how much there is. But yeah, there is a bias in the fossil record, which is something we should always keep in mind.
a lot more of their bones in places like the levaitre pits than other carnivores like the smaller gray wolves. This in itself is weird, since usually bigger carnivores are less abundant than smaller ones in an ecosystem. So the huge stacks of direwolf bones that we've found so far indicate that they were ecological oddballs. But the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and direwolves were no exception. They disappeared when the other megafauna of North America died out in the early Holocene, roughly 10,000 years ago. Which brings us to the biotechnology company that claims to have brought them back. This biotech company, called 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪�ึ a announced that they'd recreated the direwolf using an entirely new method of de-extinction. Most other attempts at any kind of de-extinction have focused on
Actually, I'm going to take a break here to quickly look at this graph because, much like Tyrant said in chat, I didn't really know that there had been many de-extinction attempts before. So I kind of want to look at, like, this graph is supposed to, like, show the old way of doing it. So it looks like it started with, like, frozen mammoth, the mammoth's DNA, its quote-unquote closest living relative, which would be the elephant, kind of spliced it together wherever there was blanks, modified it, infused it into a blank egg with an electric shock. I don't know exactly how the science of that works, so I'm just going to assume that is correct. I know that SciShow fact checks their videos, so I'm just going to assume that's correct. A developing embryo, surrogate mother, pregnancy, mammoth elephant hybrid. Okay.
Cloning an individual member of the species and then having one of their close living relatives act as a surrogate. People have talked about doing this for all kinds of species, from woolly mammoths to thylacines. But most of these attempts haven't been that successful because cloning is hard. A 2024 paper suggests you have only a 2 to 10% chance of achieving a successful birth via cloning, and that's for the not extinct animals. These hurdles get even higher for mammals owing to the way their young develop. So to get around all of that, scientists at 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪 tried a different approach. Rather than recreate the direwolf through a process like cloning, they took a shortcut and used gray wolves as their starting canvas, because gray wolves are their closest relatives, right? We will come back to that. The idea was to compare the direwolf and gray wolf genomes side by side and then just write in the most important direwolfy bits to get direwolves.
See, there's already a problem with that thought process on the scientist side. Is one, yeah, that does feel pretty backwards. But two, it's like we don't know much about them behaviorally, like socially. We don't know much of that, so just tweaking things to match, to me that sounds more like genetic manipulation, like we did like with other animals, except for we did that through selective breeding over time. This just sounds like a fancy like gene manipulation version of that. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like that's how we got like pugs and all those kinds of things. So I'm not even in my non-sciencey brain. Yeah. That just sounds like, yeah.
If it was that easy, you would think someone would have already done it, but fun fact, it is not that easy. First problem, we do not have the direwolf genome. Not all of it, anyway. While other studies had published direwolf genetic data, it wasn't as complete as the researchers needed it to be. So they found their own. Using a 13,000-year-old direwolf tooth and a 72,000-year-old skull, the researchers sequenced a larger total percentage of the direwolf.
So I'm just gonna comment, and they're probably about to talk about this, but there can be a lot of genetic differences between 13 and like, somebody else do the math on this, but like 72 minus 13, so that's roughly what, 59,000 years? Somebody fact check me on my math there. Yeah, that is worthwhile research even without the de-extinction stuff, but like, yeah. But the difference between 59,000 years could be astronomical. Like, I know evolution is slow, but I feel like it's safe to assume that at that rate, there would be a significant change in like their DNA. Like it still would probably be very, very similar, but it yeah. Moving on.
wolf genome. When it comes to replicating DNA like this, you can check how good your yield was by basically seeing how many identical copies of the same bit of code you're able to sequence. And when we're talking about ancient DNA, 5 copies or more usually means that you got enough high-quality DNA to be confident enough that you put all the pieces together. According to a preprint of their paper, they got high-quality copies for 6% of the genome out of the tooth and 82% from the skull. This is a genuinely huge leap up from what the researchers were able to capture in that 2021 paper, and this team deserves major props for getting this much usable DNA from these fossils. But I do want to note that as of right now, this preprint is not yet peer-reviewed or even necessarily finalized, so this could change. Also, most of the rest of this story is from their PR materials, and the data aren't available as of this recording. They identified a few dozen genes that differed between dire wolves and gray wolves, some of which controlled body size. They also found a few that indicate dire wolves had paler coats than modern wolves, which we never could have known about without the new genetic material. The researchers then edited the genes of gray wolf embryos to match some of the dire wolf genes.
Again, that just sounds like genetic editing, like what I think that they want to do to humans. Like, is that not the same as like them trying to, like, they want to fine-tune / tweak the human genome to like designer babies or something, or at least stop certain defects from being passed down or something? I don't know. Someone fact check me. To be a cynic, almost any time scientists go to the press before journals, it's a bit of a scam. I'm not going to say I 100% agree with that, but yeah. Designer babies is a wild thing to hear. Yeah. Yeah. Historically speaking. Yeah, no, historically speaking. And can you really trust a PR team to accurately retell what the scientists are saying too? Because like a whole bunch of non-science people trying to explain a science thing would be like me trying to explain how to assemble a car battery.
The resulting embryos were implanted into surrogate mothers, and they were off to the races. The result is wolf pups that are larger than gray wolf pups with pale coats. Right now, there's 3 of them, brothers Romulus and Remus, who are from the same litter, and Khaleesi, who was born later.
Okay, I'm actually gonna... PR only cares about looks? Yeah. So I'm looking at these puppies, and I agree they're kind of cute, but do you not agree that their face has some sort of... something looks wrong? Like, I know that they're still puppies and they're still growing, so their face shape could change a lot, but like, this one's pupils, if these are unedited photos, this one's pupils are oddly shaped. Romulus's pupils specifically are oddly shaped. Like, the cheeks and the face definition just doesn't look normal. And I also wonder, like, editing a genome like this, could this not bring up more genetic defects and basically cause like some sort of suffering for the animals? Like, ethically speaking, are you not potentially creating a suffering animal for no reason? Moving on.
There's Romulus and Remus, who are from the same litter, and Khaleesi, who was born later. The SciShow team has notes about those name choices, but whatever. They made a total of 20 changes to 14 genes, and 15 of those changes match up to what they found in the direwolf.
Okay, so again, another issue I'm immediately seeing here is genomes are like, there's a lot of genes. Tweaking 20 parts of them doesn't really sound like a lot. It depends. If the gray wolf genome is well known, a lot of obvious problems are easily avoided. True, but at the same time, like, the obvious problems may be avoided, but other things can come up. Like, obviously, they're going to try their best to make sure that they have a good quality of life, but they can't guarantee it. Which, again, brings us back to ethics and blah, 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 blah. Honestly, I mean, it's worth the risk to bring them back, but that doesn't mean they will look like how they are/were. Also, they might not live or have the skills as they used to have. No, there's no chance that they will, because we don't know. That's gonna just be in the recording, and I'm gonna have to edit that out later. But yeah. Gosh, this is already 17 minutes long, and we're only 5 minutes in. Thank you.
DNA they sequenced. For the rest, they made edits that they claim were comparable to what was in the dire wolf genome. And while they've released plenty of photos of these wolves to the public, and they are very pretty, there are lots of scientists who say that the claim that these are dire wolves is overstated. For starters, there are some flaws in the idea that gray wolves are a perfect template to use for building a dire wolf. It's been pointed out that genetic evidence doesn't support the idea that gray wolves are the closest relatives of dire wolves, or even that close at all relative to the Canid family tree. In fact, a 2021 study on dire wolf genetics found that the dire wolves and other modern canids were so distantly related that it supports keeping them in a separate genus, calling them 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗪 instead of Canisdirus. If you caught that we flashed 2 different systematic names on screen at the beginning of this video, that is why. The current consensus is that dire wolves split from all other canids over 5 million years ago, and the branch of the tree with everything from coyotes and jackals to gray wolves originates in Africa, while the line that gave rise to dire wolves is all American, putting dire and gray wolves on totally different sides of the family tree. And here's the weird thing. While 𝗙𝗧𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪's marketing team says that their genetic evidence puts gray wolves as the closest living relatives of dire wolves, their actual family tree doesn't. Like, their own tree shows the living wolves and dholes and jackals all being their own group, and dire wolves branching off earlier. I also want to be clear here, what they show is that all living canids are equally closely related to dire wolves. So it would have been perfectly fine for them to say that and then add that they picked gray wolves because they're big, or also in the Americas, or any other reason. It's just a weird thing to
Yeah, like, I'm gonna go back to that graphic. I don't know if I'm misunderstanding that, but like, to me, this graph looks like it's implying that, like, 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗪 would have been the closest one, not Canis. I don't know if I'm understanding that correctly, because, like, if we're going based off of branches, it goes down, it branches off into the 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗪, and then that's like saying the hamburger is the same thing as a meatloaf. Yeah. They really used the dire wolf's most distant cousin as a template. And, like, again, evolution is weird, and it's just ugh.
Dholes and jackals all being their own group, and dire wolves branching off earlier. I also want to be clear here, what they show is that all living canids are equally closely related to dire wolves. So it would have been perfectly fine for them to say that and then add that they picked gray wolves because they're big or also in the Americas or any other reason. It's just a weird thing to claim. Now, there's another reason that many scientists aren't convinced that these pups should be considered dire wolves, and to explain it, we have to talk about what a species even is. Because the thing is, researchers don't have just one definition for a species. We have at least 25. They're called species concepts, which are basically a bunch of working definitions of the term that scientists use in different research contexts. And the reason we need so many is that actually, defining a species is way harder than it seems, as in nobody has come up with a satisfying definition for a species that can be applied to every living thing. Hence, researchers have spent decades arguing with each other trying to come up with the least bad definition, and it all started with one. One of the OG species concepts was the brainchild of Ernst Mayr, one of the founders of modern evolutionary biology. He came up with what's called the biological species concept, which says that if you have a population of organisms that interbreed with each other and don't interbreed with others, those breeding populations make up a species. Which is interesting, because in order to have a species, you catch up to what they found in the direwolf DNA they sequenced. For the rest, they made edits that they called living relatives of dire wolves, their actual family tree. Because the thing is, researchers any gene flow into that group. It's that gene flow across the in-group that unites them, as called the biological species concept, which says that if you have a population of organisms that interbreed with each other and don't interbreed with others, those breeding populations make up a species. Which is interesting, because in order to have a species, you kind of have to have two. You need to be able to identify populations that have gene flow with each other, but you also need populations that don't get any gene flow into that group. It's that gene flow across the in-group that unites them as one species. But those of you who are interested in microbes might see a problem, because organisms that don't reproduce sexually can't be accounted for in this definition. And microbiologists aren't the only ones who've got beef with the biological species concept, since it relies on the ability to observe how populations interact and how they breed. It's nearly impossible to apply the biological species concept to any species that.
And also, wouldn't that make, under that definition, wouldn't grizzly bears and polar bears and the same species? Because they can interbreed and they can have children, and those children can have viable offspring who can have children, so on and so forth. Also, if we have three species, A, B, C, there are examples of A and B breeding and B and C breeding, but not A and C. Yeah. Also, there are a lot of ethnicities of different species that don't always interbreed. Exactly. Yeah, it's a very flawed definition.
That are extinct. Which means that paleontologists have had to come up with their own species concepts, and there are a few. One of the more general criticisms of the biological species concept is that it only applies to a snapshot of time and doesn't take history into account. So some other researchers came up with a concept that does, the lineage species concept. The lineage species concept says that a species consists of a group of organisms with a single ancestor-descendant relationship that makes up one connected branch on the evolutionary tree. This lets you combine the populations past and present to define your species. But the downside is that the best way to prove these ancestor-descendant relationships is with DNA evidence, and once you get too far back into the fossil record, there just isn't any. When that happens, researchers turn to a tried and true way of evaluating evidence, their eyeballs. Under the morphological species concept, two or more organisms are part of the same species if they share enough physical attributes, especially if those are unique as compared to other organisms.
again, these both are like the ancestor one doesn't really work because again that requires DNA and blah 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 blah. There is no good way to define a species currently that I know of, because like there's the if it looks the similar, technically you can reason like, well, rhinos and elephants are pretty similar. They have tusks and horns. Those are kind of similar. They have like similar skin. They can both swim. It's very flawed logic. The physical attributes make sense, but just take a look at the sheer variety of dog breeds that show the flaws in that logic. That too. Like, yeah. I don't think that there's ever going to be a way to properly define species, because like we wouldn't call a pug a species. We would call it a breed. But it looks pretty darn different than the other kinds of dogs. It's
Basically, if they look the same, they are the same.
Yeah.
This is a
There
kind
is
of
no
species
perfect.
concept of last resort, since there are a whole bunch of potential pitfalls. Like, for instance, what if you find a fossil of an individual with a pathology that makes it look different from its group? You might unknowingly make up a new species just for this fossil when that doesn't reflect reality. With all of that out of the way, we've covered how hard it is to figure out what a species is.
Yeah.
So let's talk about
Very
whether
hard.
these new direwolf pups fit the bill. It should be pretty clear that the biological species concept is immediately out. There are only 3 of these pups in existence, and odds are that their caretakers won't allow them to breed on their own. Next up is the lineage species concept, and again, this shoe doesn't fit. The egg cells that all of these wolves developed from were from a dog, and the genetic code used in forming their genome was ever so slightly modified gray wolf DNA, meaning that the living pups have no direct ancestor-descendant connection to the dire wolves of days gone by. Now, here is where it gets a little hazy. The researchers at 𝗙𝗧𝗟𝗏 argue that if their wolves have enough genetic tweaks that make these wolves look like the dire wolves, then that's just as good as having a living clone.
But we don't even know for certain what they look like. Like, we have a vague idea, but we'll never know one-to-one what they look like. Like, using the method that they used, it will never be a dire wolf. Yeah, like how can they aren't comparing them to anything. They have nothing to compare to. They have some hypotheses, but it's just no. It doesn't even count as a clone if it isn't the same genetics. Yeah, like, and even if it was a clone, there are issues with that too. It's just, ugh. Unless we find a specimen that's frozen in ice, we won't have a solid reference point. Yeah, and it would have to be frozen completely intact, like some of the woolly mammoths were. But even then, it's like, realistically, the only way I can see us actually, quote unquote, de-extincting direwolves would be like if we somehow found preserved, frozen, kind of alive eggs, and even then it's just, I don't think we've ever found eggs that are 100% intact enough to, it's just the way that they're doing this, it's impossible to make. All you're doing is genetic engineering. It's all you're doing. Yeah. And yeah, it isn't unprecedented to find something completely intact, but it's very unlikely, especially considering the climate that they seem to inhabit. And again, okay, we got them to look like dire wolves. Let's just say they somehow look exactly like dire wolves. We don't know what that looked like, but somehow we nailed it. We nailed it. Behavior. Yeah, like the research itself, as Tyrant says, is interesting, but the reasoning and presentation of it just doesn't line up with the facts, you know?
The morphological species concept, but for living animals. But that also relies on us assuming that these pups actually look and act like extinct direwolves, and we don't know that they do. In fact, there's a good argument that they don't. When Colossal selected the genes that they were going to tweak in the wolves, they noticed that some of the genes present in the dire wolves were related to some not so great health effects in gray wolves, like deafness or blindness. So rather than copy those exact mutations over, they made edits that would approximate those same effects. But we have no way of knowing if they got it right, because we don't have the original dire wolves to compare to. And we haven't even gotten into the ethical concerns around bringing back dire wolves, of which there are many. Like we said at the beginning, dire wolves...
I forgot to turn on the subtitles chat. I'm so sorry.
Lived in an ecosystem that's fundamentally different from the one we have today. None of their original prey are alive, and having nothing to eat was what killed them all last time. So some researchers argue that there's no point in bringing them back because nature has already recovered from their absence, and it would be cruel to bring back a species that has no place being anything other than a cover model for a George R.R. Martin novel. From all of this, it seems pretty clear that Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi are in fact a trio of gray wolves with a killer PR team. They might be able to tell us some stuff about the extinct dire wolves, but the biggest thing they reveal is just how far we are from ever truly bringing an extinct species back from the dead.
Yeah, I really have to agree with that last point that they made there. It's like, again, ethical concerns for one, again, the concerns for the other. It's just there are too many things that we cannot account for in order to say that it is or is not correct. It's just it's a mess. Let me catch up on chat real quick. The behavior of the animals is usually quite hard-coded into genes, but there are a lot of behavioral aspects that come from actually living in specific climate and growing their own species. And growing with their own species. Sorry, I can't read today. Yeah. No, I definitely agree. But again, since most of the genes are still gray wolf genes, I wouldn't even call that in the same ballpark. I would say they might end up acting like weird funky gray wolves. So they basically have a risk where they would have sickness or disease that they don't know about. Exactly. Big agree. Yes, same. Given the things they're doing for the quote unquote dire wolves, they're definitely not authentic. Yeah. We can't receive an extended species. There are many reasons why, but the most obvious reason is their environment. Their environment is not the same as the environment they were in before, which makes their survival rate extremely low. Yeah, like these animals are basically going to have to be raised and hand-fed by humans forever for their entire existence. It's just, it doesn't make sense. Looking at it as a recreation / de-extinction does not make sense. They're just genetically engineered gray wolves. Actually, receiving the species is much harder than it sounds, so the current milestone is already a very big leap. Reviving. Wow. I don't think I read reviving there. Yeah. No, I think I said receiving. Reviving. Yes. Reviving a species is much harder than it sounds, so the current milestone is already a very big step. And I agree that this is cool in concept, but again, I wouldn't count this as a step towards revival. I would count this as a step towards recreation. Because, like, again, there's, at least right now, there's no way to get it one-to-one. Ugh. Oh. The preprint, and George R.R. Martin is listed as an author, for which he most certainly has no credentials. And he's also an investor in the company, which makes the naming choices even worse, if that is true. It might be weird, but even their oxygen is not the same. Yeah, because the O2 levels change significantly. Like, not significantly, but big enough. Yeah, it just isn't practical, as Rickety said. Again, there are so many ethical concerns, so we're just going to throw out ethical concerns for now. I'm just going to throw those out for the moment. It's just... the very backbone of which they're trying to describe this as doesn't make any sense. Like, it is not a de-extinction. Claiming that, even if it's just for PR purposes, is scientifically and just logically inaccurate. And I get they need to cut height to do more of the research, but again, that's an ethical problem. Is lying for the sake of improving research ethical? Is creating more misinformation ethical? It's just, it's ugh. But anyways, with that, chat, we're gonna end the video here. Thank you all so much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Everyone say bye, YouTube. Thanks, Tyrant. You get me. Yeah. Bye.